The hearing room in the United States Senate looked no different than it always did: polished oak desks, brass nameplates gleaming under the overhead lights, reporters shuffling their notes in the gallery, cameras quietly humming as they broadcast to millions of households across America. It was Tuesday morning in Washington. Outside, the nation's capital buzzed with its usual self-importance motorcades weaving through the fog, aides rushing down marbled corridors, power brokers negotiating over coffee and calculation. But inside room 216 of the Hart Senate office building, something quieter yet far more dangerous was about to unfold. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, dressed in a sharp navy suit, sat in silence at the far end of the chamber. At 43, she was younger than most in the room, but her posture radiated focus. Her dark eyes drifted across the rows of senators, staffers, and cameras. She wasn't here to be noticed, she was here to listen. Across from her, seated with the ease of a man who had survived more political storms than most people had birthdays, was Senator Mitch McConnell, 2 years old, Senate Minority Leader, a fixture of American politics for 4 decades. His pale hands rested calmly on the table, his thin smile practiced, his reputation as an immovable force well earned. The agenda today: an oversight hearing on disaster relief funding, the kind of bureaucratic routine that normally passed without fanfare. But for Jasmine, this was personal. Weeks earlier, torrential floods had ravaged the southern counties of Texasshire District. Entire neighborhoods underwater, families displaced, roads crumbled, power grids failing. She had walked the muddy streets herself, seen the water lines creeping up shattered living room walls, smelled the rot of ruined belongings. And now, they were here to debate, to posture, to decide who gets help and who gets forgotten. The hearing began, senators offering opening remarks peppered with statistics, carefully worded condolences, and, of course, veiled political jabs. It was all predictable. Until McConnell spoke. His tone was smooth, measured, the product of 40 years in Washington. But underneath, that familiar edge of detached authority. "We must prioritize fiscal responsibility," he declared, his voice carrying across the room. "We cannot continue to reward communities that fail to properly prepare for natural disasters. Resilience starts at home. The federal government is not a piggy bank for poor planning." The words floated across the chamber like smoke, measured, polite, lethal. For most in the room, it was just another soundbite. But for Jasmine, the sentence cut deeper than any insult. She thought of the family she met: elderly couple sleeping in their car after their home collapsed, the single mother carrying her child through waist-deep floodwaters, the small-town volunteers rebuilding bridges with their bare hands. She thought of her own childhood growing up in those same storm-battered neighborhoods, watching her father work 3 jobs after hurricanes destroyed their home, watching her mother weep over FEMA paperwork that never came, watching politicians talk about self-reliance from the safety of their D.C. offices, while communities like hers drowned literally and figuratively. And now, decades later, here sat Mitch McConnell, powerful, untouchable, reducing an entire region's suffering to a lesson in personal responsibility. The cameras didn't catch her expression. Her jaw stayed relaxed. Her hands remained steady on the folder of documents in front of her. But inside, the weight of that moment pressed against her chest, a familiar ache that never quite faded. The room moved. Senators traded rehearsed questions. Witnesses recited reports. Staffers scribbled notes. But Jasmine, she stayed still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She didn't react. Because she understood what Washington rarely did. Real battles aren't won in the moment of insult. They're won in the quiet, the preparation, the patience, the precision. Her gaze lingered on McConnell as he answered another softball question, his voice dripping with condescension masked as experience. The same old Washington theater. But today would be different. Because behind her silence, beneath the surface, Jasmine had come prepared, not for a soundbite, not for applause, but for the truth, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, the kind that waits, the kind that cuts deeper than arrogance. The invisible push had come, and now there was no turning back. The hearing adjourned for lunch, and the room emptied in wave senators retreating to private offices, aides glued to their phones, reporters whispering about deadlines and headlines. But Jasmine Crockett stayed seated, her hands still resting on the folder of notes in front of her. The words from McConnell echoed, unwanted but familiar. The federal government is not a piggy bank for poor planning. Poor planning. That's what they called it now. As if people in her district had planned for levees to fail, for floodwaters to rise faster than rescue boats could reach, for the slow, grinding neglect that left small towns with aging infrastructure and emergency systems stretched to the breaking point. Jasmine stood, smoothing the lines of her navy suit, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she walked toward the window overlooking Constitution Avenue. The city hummed beneath her, powerful, relentless, indifferent. It wasn't the first time she had heard words like McConnell's. She heard them when she was 8 years old, standing beside her mother in a flooded community center, waiting for FEMA to show up, except they never did. Just a Red Cross volunteer handing out bottled water and canned soup while officials debated resource allocation on television. She heard them again at 17, after Hurricane Ike ripped through the Gulf, when politicians promised swift federal aid but neighbors rebuilt their homes with scrap wood and prayers. And she heard them in law school, when professors praised policies that sounded logical on paper but left entire zip codes forgotten in practice. Poor planning. It was easier to blame the victims than to question the system. But Jasmine had learned to smile through it, to sit in classrooms where no one looked like her, to argue cases in courtrooms where her presence was tolerated, not welcomed, to campaign in neighborhoods dismissed by Washington as irrelevant. And she learned to carry the weight, the silent, invisible load of expectations, doubts, and the knowledge that people like her weren't supposed to make it this far. That weight never went away. Even now, as a member of Congress, with her name etched onto office doors and her face broadcast on national news, Jasmine still felt it like sandbags tied to her chest, reminding her that every step forward could be erased by a single sentence from someone like Mitch McConnell. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her district director in Texas. Power's still down in parts of Jefferson County. Folks asking when help's coming. Jasmine exhaled slowly. Jefferson County, where she was born, where her father spent his life working construction jobs that barely paid the bills, where her mother still lived, her hands calloused from years cleaning office buildings, just like the ones lining Capitol Hill. Help wasn't coming, not fast enough, not fairly enough. The Federal Disaster Relief Fund was stalled, bottlenecked by the same political games that had plagued Washington for decades. Funds diverted, aid delayed, communities abandoned under the guise of budget discipline. And now, McConnell, master of Senate procedure, king of obstructions, sat comfortably while families in her district waded through toxic floodwaters and prayed the next storm wouldn't be worse. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but her expression stayed composed. She turned from the window, walking back toward the staff room, where young aides bustled with laptops and legal pads. They looked up as she entered, wide-eyed, expectant, hopeful. They didn't see the weight behind her smile. But it was there. It had been there the day she watched her father collapse from heat exhaustion on a work-Satian accident, preventable if safety inspections weren't bypassed for profit. It had been there when she cleaned motel rooms at 16, saving tips to help her mother pay the electric bill after FEMA assistance never materialized. It had been there when she argued her first civil rights case, representing families displaced by unchecked development and ignored by politicians. And it was there now as she prepared to challenge the most powerful man in the Senate. Her chief of staff, Marcus, approached quietly. "You okay?" he asked, concern etched across his features. Jasmine nodded. "Yeah," she replied softly, scanning the documents in her folder. "I'm just remembering why I came here. Because it wasn't for headlines, it wasn't for partisan brawls or viral sound bites. It was for Jefferson County. For the families still drying out soggy carpets, boiling contaminated water, filing insurance claims that would take months, maybe years to process. For the communities labeled underserved by bureaucrats, left to drown by policymakers more interested in military contracts than emergency response. For the 8-year-old girl who stood in a flooded gymnasium, watching helicopters pass overhead, wondering why no one landed to help. The weight behind her smile was heavy, but it was hers to carry. Because with every step, every speech, every prepared remark, she inched closer to breaking the cycle of neglect. Jasmine flipped through her folder, eyes scanning line items in the federal disaster relief budget, seeing clearly the disparities, the favoritism, the hidden hand of politics shaping who lived and who suffered. McConnell's fingerprints were all over either directing funds, blocking bills, securing pork projects for allies, while criticizing those who dared ask for help. And yet, he smiled. He smiled, because people like him always did secure in the knowledge that power insulated them from consequence. Jasmine's smile tightened. She had learned to smile, too. But behind hers lived the weight of every family ignored, every storm politicized, every life reduced to a statistic. She would carry that weight onto the Senate floor. And when the time came, when the cameras rolled, when the nation listened, she wouldn't need anger or outrage or theatrics. She would need truth. Precise, unyielding, heavy as the water that once flooded her childhood streets. Jasmine closed the folder, straightened her blazer, and headed back toward the chamber. The smile stayed in place. But the weight behind it, that was where the real power lived. The Senate chamber filled again after lunch, senators sliding back into their seats, staffers adjusting microphones, photographers repositioning for the best angles. To the outside observer, it looked routine. But for Jasmine Crockett, every detail felt magnified. The weight behind her smile pressed heavier now, not from fear but from knowing the moment she had prepared for was approaching. Across the room, Mitch McConnell shuffled papers with the calm of a man convinced nothing could touch him. His trademark smirk rested comfortably in place, the faint arrogance of someone who had outmaneuvered political opponents for over 4 decades. The hearing reconvened. Chairman Durbin cleared his throat, tapping the gavel lightly. We'll resume with discussions regarding the federal disaster relief appropriations and oversight measures. A blur of formalities followed, senators questioning witnesses, bureaucrats reciting statistics, numbers tossed around like poker chips in a game the public never truly understood. But Jasmine understood. She watched as McConnell deflected inquiries about aid delays, his words polished, rehearsed. We must be fiscally prudent, he repeated. Taxpayer dollars should be spent responsibly. Local communities bear primary responsibility for disaster preparedness. The same script, repackaged, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who believed accountability was optional. Reporters typed half-heartedly. Cameras panned lazily across the room. And then her name was called. The chair recognizes Congresswoman Crockett, Durbin announced. Jasmine rose, her heart steady, her expression unreadable. The room settled. McConnell's eyes flickered toward her, amusement dancing behind his Glicessa freshman congresswoman from Texas, here to make her case. He'd seen it before. They came in passionate. They left politically bruised. But Jasmine didn't approach the podium for a spectacle. She approached with purpose. Her folder of documents rested beside her, untouched for now. She began softly. Senator McConnell, I've listened carefully to your remarks this morning about responsibility, about planning, about communities needing to take care of themselves. Her tone was calm, measured the quiet before the storm. McConnell nodded, his smirk unwavering. That's correct, Congresswoman. We all have a role to play in preparedness. The gallery barely stirred, another political exchange unfolding, expected, forgettable. But then, the curtain slipped. Jasmine's voice sharp and subtle, but impossible to ignore. It's interesting, Senator, she continued, eyes fixed on him, because I reviewed the federal appropriations from the last 5 years, and I couldn't help but notice some patterns. She opened her folder, pulling out neatly tabbed documents, The room's energy shifted, imperceptibly at first, like the faint tension before a thunderstorm. Kentucky, Jasmine stated evenly, has received over $4.2 billion in federal infrastructure grants, military facility upgrades, and disaster mitigation funds during that period. McConnell straightened slightly, his smirk faltering just a fraction. Meanwhile, Jasmine pressed, my district, Jefferson County, Texas Shaw's, faced 2 federally declared disasters in that same window. Our total federal assistance? Less than $110 million. The murmurs began, reporters pausing, senators exchanging glances. McConnell cleared his throat, leaning toward his microphone. Congresswoman, But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her voice, still controlled, carried the precision of years spent building legal cases brick by brick. I'm not here to suggest your home state doesn't deserve assistance, but when you sit there, Senator, and imply that communities suffering from unprecedented floods, from failures in levees and infrastructure decades overdue for upgrades, somehow deserve less support because they failed to plan, I have to wonder. The smirk was gone now, replaced by the familiar, tight-lipped deflection McConnell reserved for moments when control slipped through his fingers. Jasmine lifted a second document. Page 17 of the Appropriations Report, Senator, she stated, lists $128 million allocated for flood prevention infrastructure in eastern Kentucky, most of which, according to these audits, funded private contracts to construction firms with direct ties to your campaign donors. A hush swept the chamber. McConnell shifted uncomfortably. The curtain had slipped further, but Jasmine wasn't done. Her next words were quieter, but they hit harder than any raised voice could have. My community isn't asking for favors, Senator, she said, her voice steady as stone. We're asking for the same consideration, the same urgency, the same respect that you've ensured for your constituents and your allies for decades. McConnell opened his mouth to respond, but the usual dismissiveness, the carefully practiced rhetoric, faltered beneath the weight of the facts laid bare. The gallery leaned in. Cameras zoomed closer. This wasn't politics as usual anymore. It was exposure. It was the unmasking of a system that claimed to be equitable, but rewarded the connected while punishing the forgotten. And Jasmine Crockett had peeled back that mask with calm precision. She stepped back from the podium, letting the silence linger. Because in that pause, in that breathless moment, the room realized something. The freshman congresswoman from Texas wasn't here to play Washington's game. She was here to rewrite it. And McConnell? For the first time in years, his footing felt uncertain. The curtain hadn't just slipped, it was collapsing. The stillness inside the hearing room was palpable, like the air itself had thickened. Even the C-SPAN cameras, normally drifting between wide angles and forgettable shots, held steady now, fixed on Jasmine Crockett. She stood calm, her notes untouched, her expression composed. Across from her, Mitch McConnell adjusted his tie, reaching for the familiar mask of control, but it no longer fit the way it used to. His team whispered behind him, passing papers, eyes darting across the gallery. The rhythm of Washington had shifted. But Jasmine, she wasn't rushing. Years in the courtroom had taught her that timing mattered more than volume, and sometimes the sharpest blades were words chosen precisely not, shouted impulsively. She lifted another document, an internal audit from the Government Accountability Office. Her voice was soft, but it sliced through the silence. Senator McConnell, she began, you spoke earlier about responsibility, about ensuring taxpayer dollars aren't wasted on communities that fail to plan. McConnell nodded cautiously, his usual confidence now tempered by the evidence accumulating on the table. Jasmine continued, this report details $312 million in federal disaster funds allocated to Kentucky over the last 3 years, funds intended for flood mitigation, yet nearly 60% remains unaccounted for or tied up in private contracts facing legal disputes. The murmurs rippled louder now, journalists scribbling frantically, aides leaning in. McConnell opened his mouth to counter, but Jasmine was already there, steady, prepared. "I'm not here to question your commitment to your state, Senator," she said, her tone unwavering. "But I do question the selective nature of your outrage, the narrative that communities like mine, struggling after back-to-back natural disasters, somehow deserve scorn instead of support, while millions flow quietly into your state, with little oversight." She placed the report down gently, like setting a scalpel on the operating table. "That's not fiscal discipline, Senator," she added. "That's favoritism dressed up as responsibility." McConnell shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing, his fingers tapping anxiously against his notes. But Jasmine wasn't there to provoke emotion, she was there to expose patterns. She flipped to another page. "Let's talk about military spending," she pivoted, her cadence sharp but contained. "The Bluegrass Army Depot in Kentucky received $450 million in federal upgrades last year, approved without hesitation, despite clear evidence from the Defense Department that those projects were non-essential during peacetime operations." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Meanwhile, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed $78 million in critical flood control improvements for Jefferson County, Texas projects that would have directly prevented last month's devastation, but that funding never made it past committee. McConnell's jaw tensed, his defense mechanisms flickering behind cautious eyes. The room listened, quiet but charged. And then, Jasmine delivered the cut that mattered most, not with anger, but with quiet clarity. "Senator, I don't need to win an argument today," she stated plainly, "but I need the American people to see the math undeniable imbalance in how resources flow, how priorities are chosen, how certain communities are lifted up, while others are told to plan better after the floodwaters rise." She let the silence breathe 2 seconds, maybe 3, but enough to hold the weight. "I represent families who've lost everything twice in 5 years," she continued, voice steady. "They didn't fail to plan. They failed to buy influence. And that's not on them, that's on this building." Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. McConnell's team exchanged alarmed glances. Jasmine leaned in, not physically, but with the precision of someone landing the final, undeniable point. "Resilience doesn't come from slogans, Senator," she finished. "It comes from equal investment, from leadership that sees every community as worthy, not just the ones with political leverage." The words lingered, cutting, exposing, undeniable. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She didn't need to. Because when truth is sharpened properly, it cuts all on its own. McConnell offered no rebuttal, only the tight-lipped stare of a man caught between practiced power and the reality unraveling in front of him. Jasmine gathered her papers, her expression unchanged. The blade had fallen, but there was no blood, only the quiet understanding that the rules of this room, this town, this game, had shifted. And everyone watching knew it. The hearing room emptied slowly after Jasmine's closing remarks. Reporters filed out. First heads bowed over their phones, already crafting headlines. Staffers lingered, whispering in corners. The cameras shut off, their tiny red lights blinking out like fading embers. But the words? They stayed. They didn't fail to plan. They failed to buy influence. It echoed through marble halls, rode the quiet tension down stairwells, settled into conversations in coffee shops across Capitol Hill. McConnell left the chamber with his team clustered around him, tight, defensive, low voices, exchanging hurried strategies. His signature smirk? Gone. His steps, normally measured and certain, carried an edge of unease. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't need to. The damage wasn't measured in sound bites, but in the shift no one could unsee. Jasmine Crockett gathered her documents calmly, her expression unreadable. She hadn't come for applause. She came for accountability. And now it was rippling outward. By the evening, clips of her questioning circulated on social media, framed not as partisan attack, but as a rare display of clarity in a town addicted to theatrics. MSNBC aired the full exchange, labeling it a masterclass in congressional oversight. Even CNN's more cautious anchors acknowledged the impact. We've seen passionate speeches before, But Congresswoman Crockett's approach was different, quiet, relentless, surgical. Fox News tried to spin it, calling her performance scripted political theater. But even some conservative pundits, grudgingly, conceded her facts were airtight. In living rooms from Houston to Louisville, from college dorms to union halls, Americans replayed the moment. The calm precision, the facts laid bare, the unspoken reminder that power, no matter how entrenched, is vulnerable to truth. Jasmine didn't return to the cameras that night. Instead, she walked the quiet corridors of the Capitol, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors. Her phone buzzed with messages, constituents thanking her, colleagues offering quiet support, journalists requesting interviews. But one message lingered. Her mother, back in Jefferson County, had texted simply, "Your father would be proud. Keep your feet on the ground." Jasmine smiled softly, the weight of those words settling over her. She had stood in that hearing room not as a politician seeking spotlight, but as a daughter of Texas, as a witness for communities long dismissed, as proof that resilience looks like preparation, not privilege. By morning, the repercussions unfolded. Senate leadership announced an independent audit of disaster relief funds, an unusual but politically necessary concession. The Appropriations Committee scheduled emergency hearings on infrastructure disparities across regions. McConnell's office issued a carefully worded statement, sidestepping direct acknowledgement but hinting at a review of funding practices to ensure fairness for all Americans. It wasn't an admission, but it was movement. More importantly, it was discomfort. And for someone like Mitch, McConnell, discomfort was unfamiliar territory. In Texas, Jasmine's district office phone lines lit up not with anger, but with renewed hope. Flood survivors called to share stories. Community leaders requested meetings. Young activists, many too young to vote, posted online, "If she can hold them accountable, so can we." The ripple was spreading. But Jasmine? She returned home quietly, days Laterno, motorcade, no press conferences. She walked Jefferson County's streets, still bearing the scars of floodwaters, the sagging rooftops, the boarded windows, the weary resilience etched on neighbors' faces. They greeted her not as a headline but as Jasmine, the girl they remembered, the woman who hadn't forgotten them. At a town hall in a modest community center, an older man approached, his boots caked in dried mud from weeks of rebuilding. "I watched you," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "You made 'em listen. Doesn't fix everything, but it's a start." Jasmine nodded, the weight still resting behind her, smile but lighter now, shared among those who understood the fight wasn't won in a day. It was won in the echo, and truth, once spoken, refused to fade. Weeks turned into months. National conversation shifted. New legislation, advanced, incremental, imperfect, but real. Other lawmakers, inspired or emboldened, adopted Jasmine's approach, facts over fury, precision over performance. And Mitch McConnell, his grip on procedural dominance wavered, not shattered overnight, but cracked beneath the pressure of exposure. In press rooms, journalists referenced the Crockett exchange as a turning point, a reminder that quiet defiance, backed by preparation, could outmaneuver even the most seasoned political architects. But for Jasmine, it wasn't about legacy or headlines. It was about ensuring the people wading through floodwaters weren't invisible anymore. It was about proving that democracy doesn't belong to the loudest voice, but to those willing to do the work when no one's watching. And it was about planting echoes that power couldn't escape. She stood once more outside the Capitol, dusk settling over the National Mall, the dome glowing faintly against the evening sky. The city carried on deals made behind closed doors, speeches polished for the cameras, the machine grinding forward. But beneath the surface, the echo remained. And as long as it did, Jasmine Crockett would keep showing up, quietly prepared, relentlessly factual, carrying the weight of her community, turning it into a force Washington could no longer ignore. The echo was here to stay. You know, sometimes the most powerful moment in a room isn't when someone raises their voice, it's when they stand their ground quietly, prepared, and simply refuse to be invisible. And maybe you've been there too. Have you ever sat in a space at work, at school, maybe even around people you know and felt like your story, your community, your struggle just didn't count? Like decisions were being made, and you weren't supposed to be part of the conversation? If you have, I hope today's story reminds you of something simple, but easy to forget. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to belong to the loudest crowd to change the room. You just have to show up with the truth, with your dignity, and with the quiet belief that your voice matters, even when the odds feel stacked against you. If this story spoke to you, take a second to subscribe to the channel. We tell these moments for a reason, because every time we remember them, we remind ourselves we're not alone in this. And if you know someone who's ever felt dismissed, left behind, unseen, share this with them. Remind them their presence is powerful, even when the system says otherwise. Because like Jasmine Crockett showed us, the loudest people in the room aren't always the ones carrying the truth sometimes. It's the ones carrying the weight behind the smile. We'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.